All right, guys. Hey, this is Andrew with another episode of REI Live Columbia podcast, guys, where we talk about local real estate in Columbia, South Carolina. We really focus on the Midlands and the state of South Carolina, but we do go national with ideas, tips, and tricks, and our biggest and best uses of getting or ways of getting cash flow through real estate. So thank you for joining me again. And remember, REI Live Columbia, we meet live and virtually in downtown Columbia and around at our projects and at our meetups. So if you're interested in that, just look at the show notes below. All right. So today I'm super excited to have Todd Lyle here with us today. Todd is broker in charge at Todd Realty Partners in Columbia and Lexington. And he's also a licensed attorney here in town who's done incredible deals, been in the business through multiple ups and downs, and has really been a great mentor for me and many others in Columbia. So Todd, I welcome you. Thank you for joining us. And was there anything else I left out about you?
No. Thanks for having me. You're right, multiple ups and downs, and that's kind of the joy of this industry is it does change, and you've got to be flexible and make changes with the market. So
absolutely right. So I'm really excited about our topic today because what I asked Todd, he's a plethora of knowledge. So I had to focus this conversation and say, Todd, you've done a lot, we've done a lot, but I'd love to talk about buying on terms. What does that mean? Because a lot of our listeners are hearing that on YouTube or anywhere, other podcasts and things like that. But you are an attorney, so you can help us with like what the terms actually mean, what is the legal ramifications, but also you're an experienced investor, so you can help us actually do these deals. So I'm excited to hear about that. And so yeah, Todd, just give me first the beginning. I know you have to give us a disclaimer, so let's get
sure.
that out.
And really, that's just, you're right. I'm going to tell you the law as it relates to South Carolina at the time that I'm telling it to you. If you were to apply this to your specific facts or circumstances, it may be different. And so this is not legal advice for any particular individual, and they should seek their own legal advice for their particular issue. Having said that, the principles and the stories we'll tell and some of the deals that we've done in the past should open the door for you to ask pointed questions so that you can apply some of these techniques to yourself. So it's very useful, but just I got to make sure that as a licensed attorney, you understand that this is not blanket advice that anyone and everybody can apply. So
absolutely. And
sure.
most things in real estate are, but
right.
You guys as attorneys need to cover your bases, and
right.
I appreciate that.
Right.
So just for the introduction, for the beginning, we said buying on terms. What does that mean to you, and what are we seeing today?
Sure. So to explain what buying on terms is, the first thing is to kind of walk back from what is it not. What it's not is the plain Jane traditional real estate transaction that everybody's used to seeing, or that any guy off the street that you ask would explain when you were confronted with the question of what is it like to buy a property. The average non-terms acquisition is when you reach an agreement on a price, and you either pay cash or you go get a loan for the full amount. You bring it to the closing or the conveyance of property, and all of the money is given up front, and it's done right then and there at the closing. That would basically be buying with no terms in your favor as the buyer. So working from that, there are multiple terms you can do, whether it be some form of owner finance, some form of deferred payments, some form of agreement for deed or lease option. The amount of the payment can be fluctuating. A great example, just one tiny small step up from the conventional buy that is no terms, would be something like a balloon payment. In other words, a commercial lender says, I want to be paid off in 15 years, but to help you with your cash flow, I'm going to amortize it over 30 years. So you have a lot smaller payment, but that's a term. Now, again, that's a baby step term. That's not one that's going to be really creative and get everybody excited. But that's an example, because the alternative is the bank says, I want to be paid over 15 years. So you just amortize it over 15 years. Well, the term that you slide in there is I want to lower the payment. So I'm going to amortize it over 30 years, and I'm going to put a balloon or a maturity date that after the 15-year mark, whatever's remaining, I'm calling due. So that helps the buyer because it lowers their debt service requirement for the first 15 years. So that's generally what terms are. Why do you do that? Obviously, it varies based on your potential cash flow needs, based on if you've got a lot of investment to renovate the house and you don't want to come out of pocket for all of the acquisition costs, then you can see if the seller's willing to work with you on some of the terms. And I think the best way to explain it is to probably give a lot of different examples, but Andrew, probably the ultimate example is not really terms per se, but it really is the epitome of getting all your terms, is to buy a property subject to the existing financing where no other funds change hands. You just simply start taking over the seller's payment and they convey the title over to you. If there's a remaining balance of $100,000 on the house and you buy a subject to, then the terms are now that you've essentially piggybacked off of the entire financing structure for which that seller originally put in place, and you don't have to come up with any money.
Right. But I'm going to stop you there, Todd, because subject to is a term that we hear a lot of right now, and it goes into that creative financing. It's creative financing subject to. So you kind of define there as subject to existing financing.
Sure.
So in a real world example, that would be Mary Sue has a house. She wants to sell it for $100,000. Her mortgage is $100,000. But me as a buyer can go to Mary Sue and say, I'll take the 100. I'll buy it for 100,000 if I can use your financing, and I can buy it subject to your mortgage staying there, and I'll just keep paying those payments. That's kind of simplifying that. There's so many pieces to that puzzle. Can you tell us just how does that type of transaction work with the deed and the mortgage? And guys, a deed is the piece of paper that says you own that property. And then the mortgage is the piece of paper that secures the financing by that property. Is that right, Todd?
That's right. So the title, there's a difference between a lien theory and a title theory. Here in South Carolina, we follow, the theory that says you own your property, unlike a car, where if you finance a vehicle, the title is actually held by the bank until you finish making all the payments. Some states treat real estate that way. A lot of states, the majority of states, treat it opposite, like South Carolina, where when you own the property, the title or the deed is in your name at closing. What we do is we pledge that property as collateral through a mortgage, which basically that coupled with a promissory note says, I promise to pay. The mortgage allows that lender to basically hook into the property and use it as collateral, so that if the terms of the promissory note are not met by the borrower, the lender can now utilize that collateral to secure that debt. When you do a subject to closing, you are essentially conveying the title. So Mary Sue wants to sell you, Andrew, the house. Mary Sue's got a mortgage with Mary's bank. And then we do a subject to closing. Mary actually titles and conveys that deed over to you, Andrew. But Mary's bank is still the one who's accepting and expecting to receive the monthly mortgage payments. Very briefly, there's a lot of chatter about a due on sale clause and the acceleration of the mortgage. Those are written into almost every mortgage. The reality is, in function, I've been doing this for 18, almost 19 years. I don't know how many times I've done a subject to, but it's been over 100. And I have never once had a lender utilize the due on sale clause and say, hey, you've transferred the title, therefore all the monies are due now instead of in the form of slow monthly payments, which is what an acceleration clause or due on sale clause would be. So you'll read a lot of books, you'll hear a lot of people say, oh gosh, be weary of this of the due on sale clause. And that's true. And what that means is, again, the property's sold because you've conveyed title from one person to another. And therefore the lender, in this example, Mary's bank, has the ability to say, hey, we agreed to take small monthly payments for the next 30 years. But now we are allowed to no longer accept small monthly payments. We want the whole thing pushed forward now. And obviously, a borrower, what that basically means is I got to put a sales sign in the yard or foreclosure.
Yeah.
You can't
Yeah.
just say, sure, okay, I'll write the check. So
Yeah.
subject to, again, the property's conveyed. However, in this example, Mary's bank is still on the hook. And so you, Andrew, now, instead of having to go get your own financing and tie up your own credit or tie up your own investor, you're basically enjoying the fruits of Mary's labor and credit score or whatever it was when she got that original loan.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of risk for you as the owner or the buyer, as long as you properly disclose that. If you use an attorney to do the closing and they properly disclose that, hey, Mary's the one who signed this mortgage and promissory note, which means Mary's on the hook if the event that you, Andrew, no longer make the payments, even though you now own the house, the detrimental effects with the credit bureau, the reporting of missed payments will go against Mary, not against Andrew.
Yeah. And that's very, very, very important. As people hear about that and they try to do that technique of subject to, is that if you don't disclose that and you mess up someone's credit, you could be in big, big, big trouble. So, well, even if you do disclose it and you mess up their credit, it's a major responsibility to take on someone's mortgage like that. So we don't like to necessarily do that long term. We do that short term. When we're doing short-term renovations, we might flip it or we might refi out of that person's note. But that's just our business because I don't want to be tied to somebody for so long, in case something happens. So another benefit, you mentioned a few benefits, but another benefit for the subject to is you don't have to bring in like a down payment. Usually if you buy something, you got to get financing, you might have to do 20% down. So that saves that cash flow. So that's the subject to, which is popular right now. But Todd, there's so many other quote buying on terms. What's another example of what people could do other than traditional purchase?
Sure. So they all kind of funnel down into some form of seller financing, whether it be full-blown seller financing, whether it be secondary position owner financing, meaning in this example, let's pretend, and again, we'll talk about Mary a lot today, but let's say Mary's house is worth $200,000 and she wants to sell it to you for $200,000. But she has that $100,000 mortgage because she put a huge down payment or she's paid it down over time, and the combination of that plus the property's appreciated in value. So there's a big chunk of equity. Well, Mary could say, I want my $200,000. And you could say, well, I don't have the 200,000 because I won't make any money. I'm an investor. But what I can do is I can give you 150,000, or I can give you closer to that 200,000 if you'll let me pay you over time your equity. And again, we'll do some storytelling here in a minute because sometimes that's real live examples is the better way to see how this works. But when you have that equity position, every part of that is negotiable. The amount of payment, when the payment is made, whether there's any interest associated with it, and whether there's substitution of collateral clauses or things where you can, re-leverage that asset to go borrow against and use for other deals that have nothing to do with Mary's house. It gets kind of complicated, but if you're in an equitable position, then technically speaking, you can utilize that or leverage that for things other than just that one house.
Right. Yeah. And so you mentioned one part about everything's negotiable. One thing that I love about seller financing or any form of seller financing, carry back or the full mortgage, is that you can really make it work however you need it. So if we use this a lot when the sellers are headstrong, dead set on a price. So Mary Sue's like $200K. Nothing else, nothing less, no way. So we'll say, yeah, we can do that, but I've got to do that over 15 years or 30 years, or whatever that is, or 5 years with a balloon. You can negotiate on how long it takes you to pay that back. And you can negotiate on an interest rate, a monthly payment. Is it month plus interest? Do you go 6 months with no payments while you fix up the house and get it rented. Or if you're trying to flip it, you say, okay, Mary Sue, I'll give you 200, but that starts, after 6 months, then I'll start paying interest. And then, you had free 6 months to renovate a house. So all of those things are negotiable. And so it really boils down to, you could just make it fit. If it's a house that will cash flow from a rental perspective, then you work out your monthly payment to fit that cash flow. So if you're going to be able to rent it for $1,000 and you can afford to pay Mary Sue 500, then say, Mary Sue, I'll give you whatever you want, but I can only do it at $500 a month. However long that takes, it could be a 50-year mortgage. That seems unreasonable, but you could do whatever you want there. So that is the benefit of getting into the creative financing with sellers, because you're not bound by the bureaucracy of banks where you do what they say.
That's right. And I want to hit on one other thing before we get into that interest rate example.
Yeah.
I kind of touch on, but one of the things that one of my coaches way back in the day, there's a team called Tim Winders and Matt Galogally. I met them from the Lou Brown tree, and Tim was out of Atlanta. Matt was out of Charlotte, but they taught, never ever say no. Never ever tell the seller no. You give them the terms. If they come back to you with terms, instead of saying no, you come back with even better terms. Because if the house has got a spread in there, then there's a scenario where you can make it work. You just have to come back to them and make them tell you no, is essentially what it gets at. If Mary says, I can't let you not pay me for the first 6 months. I need you to pay me, after 3 months. Well, don't tell her, no, you can't do 3 months. Say, well, I can't do 3, but I can do 5. Make her say no. Don't let their no be the last offer. Make sure you put them in a position to tell you no, and not where you tell them no.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a great point, because you can get as creative as possible. Now, it does get to a little bit more of an experienced investor at this point. And Todd, I'll ask you, it's really hard for new people to go down this road, even though when you're new and you may not have as much money or as many connections, you look at this creative finance, it's like, oh man, yeah, I have so many options. I could figure this out. But being new, you're at a disadvantage because you don't know what all these options mean. You don't know how to record these things. You don't know how to protect yourself, protect your sellers. And you kind of get overloaded with all these things we're talking about where you can negotiate the world. So what could you do? And I think you may have done that. I'm pretty sure you did this, is joined into a group or something. What do you suggest for those newbies trying to do this? Is there like a class, a school, a program, a team? Like, where can they look to get connected to help them get through that?
Absolutely. So I think we all got started at some place. And for me, it was 2003 in a hotel conference center in Atlanta, Georgia, listening to Lou Brown. And getting the education, buying his CDs. I think, honestly, there was probably some cassette tapes at this time. I'm pretty sure there was cassette tapes, but, buying all his stuff and getting in those networking groups, getting involved in, there's an old RIA group way back in the day, Real Estate Investors Association. Now REI Live is a kind of one of the leaders in the industry. And that's where I think you're also pretty involved with the Columbia one here, local to here, us in South Carolina. But when you get yourself around like-minded folks, you can bring your deals and your questions, and folks who've been there and done that enjoy helping you walk through that. I think that anytime, we always call it deal review back in the day, but anytime you can do deal review and hear how somebody else did something, that gives you an example or an idea of how to do it yourself. But certainly involving yourself with those who've done it before is a very popular way to learn and partner with somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do want to throw that out there as we're getting kind of deep into the weeds and a lot of stuff. There's so many options in real estate, guys. Cash flow through real estate is kind of what we focus on this podcast, because I feel like there's so many different ways to do that. Um, but yeah, like you said, Todd, it's getting with like-minded individuals. REI Live in Columbia is an incredible group where this is what we do. We do deal reviews, we look at deals, we talk about creative financing, and we also help people if they're new or experienced, when they come into these troubles, they have a fork in the road, and what do I do here? How do I help the seller? How do I make this deal work? That's what we're there for. We're there to help people get through that. And so yeah, guys, if you're interested or if you need help with that, look at the comment or the notes below. Look at the show notes. You'll have our contact info, so you can find us there. But I do want to go back to, you mentioned Lou Brown. Lou Brown's a friend of mine now. I've met him a couple times, and we're going to get him on this podcast, I think. But I just love, he's so creative. He's like the genius of creativity, but he's been doing it forever. You had a kind of like a example from something you learned from him years ago. What is that?
Sure. So I'll never forget, this was probably in that 2003, 2004 arrangement, but he started talking about how when you deal with a seller, everything is negotiable. Everything is however you want to arrive on those particular terms. And so, you would obviously always forever start from a place of 0% interest. In other words, let's go back to Mary's house, and let's say Mary's house is free and clear. There's no mortgage on Mary's house, and you agree to a price of $100,000. Well, let's just assume that $1,000, for easy math, let's assume that you can rent the property for $1,400 a month. Mm-hmm. And you run the analysis, and cash flow allows you to make a payment of $1,000 a month. Well, the first thing would be, say, Mary, can I pay you $1,000 a month for the next 100 months? What you're saying is, Mary, will you please loan me money for free at 0%? But you don't say that. You say, Mary, would you let me pay you $1,000 a month for 100 months? It adds up to 100,000. That's what we agreed on, right? Well, the Lou Brown example was, I don't know that it was Mary, but we'll stick with Mary. Mary says, well, what about that interest? That's a good point, Mary. Let's talk about interest. What is the going rate on interest these days? And back then, I think it was like 6 or 7%. So I'll use that example because it sounds a little better. If you use today's 2 and 3% rates, it would be crazy. But he says, he pulls out a calculator, and he's got the calculator, and says, $1,000, 6% interest. That's 0.06, right? Yeah, okay, 0.06. So if I pay you $1,060 every month for the next 100 months, that would be 6% interest, right? And the example was, he said he used it with some old gentleman, but he's like, yeah, that's what we're going to do. That's my 6% interest. And basically what you're doing is completely ignoring the entire mathematics of the amortization of mortgages, where they're very heavy loaded on the interest and then very lightly loaded on the interest on the back end. So you've basically taken the calculation and made it simple interest. And that's not going to work on everybody. And the reality is you're again, everything's negotiable. But some people might be satisfied with those terms. And so if they don't feel like they're, or if they do feel like they're getting the deal that they want to sign up for, then the case law is very clear that the parties are free to enter into an agreement, even if it seems like a one-sided agreement. So in that case, you've just made a 6% interest payment, whereas you're getting a ton of principal pay. You're getting $1,000 of principal basically every month. So that was
that's a great example. And I'll tell you, I know we probably lost some people on that, because if you've never bought a house and looked at an amortization schedule, which is how 30 years of 12 months, 360 months, if you've never looked at how that actually pays down a principal, it is, it's like the seventh wonder of the world, right? And that's what Einstein said. You end up paying for $100,000 mortgage, paying like $250,000 at 5% interest. The math just doesn't work when that way. But if you do turn it into simple interest, you end up saving, as a buyer, you're saving a ton of money. I mean,
enormous.
Probably,
enormous. Especially if you because the end game of some houses is to hold them forever. But the end game of some houses is not to hold them forever. And so if you have a 3 to 5 year plan or a 10-year plan, or the interest or the area appreciates to the point that you want to change your your goals, or you want to move to another city, anytime you can win that principal pay down game, you're building equity significantly faster, exponentially faster than if you were to be paying your payments on a 30-year amortization.
Yeah. And so that it is a word of warning, don't get into something without knowing what your interest payments are going to be, how they're amortized, simple interest or compounded. So as me doing seller finance as an owner, where I will seller finance to people, sometimes in my head I'll do simple math and like, okay, yeah, 6% you owe us this. I'm like, no, wait. I need a schedule. Hold on, let me go get my app and do this right, because I can shoot myself in the foot and lose a lot of interest payments over the years. So that's something to be aware of, guys. Again, this is the kind of stuff where you're like, if you're new to this, you're like, oh my gosh, how can I ever make this work? How can I ever make a deal go through with this creative financing? How am I ever going to get started in real estate? And I'm going to tell you, we all felt that way in the beginning. We all got started with no knowledge. All we had were our connections. You have groups like REI Live. You got coaches that can help you along the way. But Todd, you've got a story or two that you can share that can really paint the picture of how someone new can actually do this, like how the numbers laid out and how, I say it's simple, how simple it is. It's not easy, but it is simple once you get the concept of it. So give me an example or two.
Sure. So one of the examples that I'll give you was a purchase that was done, and all of these are in Columbia. This one that I'm gonna first tell you about is one that was quite a few years ago, fairly early in my investment career. Property was on Westover Drive in Columbia, and it was a house that was distressed. It needed a new roof, dated on the inside. Seller was pretty motivated and wanted, I think, 100,000 roughly. And I may be off of my number, maybe 90,000, but it was about $150,000 house fixed up. Okay. And they wanted like 90 grand. And I think I said, I can't do 90. What I can do though is, 70 as is, or let's talk a little bit more about how we could structure the terms better. And she's like, I'm not going to sell for less than 90. I said, well, I can do your 90, but let's do it this way. And she brought her mortgage statement because I asked, and lo and behold, she had a great interest rate, and she was just about to start year 27 of a 30-year mortgage. It's an older home. And so I think there was a balance. We talked earlier about there being a ton of principal pay down on the back end. There was about $40,000-ish owed still on the balance, which meant to make her normal monthly payment for those last 3 years, you'd be paying off about $40,000 of principal. Wow. And so we took that house subject to and gave her, I believe, $20,000 at closing, with an agreement that we would pay the other $30,000 in 3 years. And she agreed to that. We gave her a second mortgage on the house. And what we proceeded to do was spend, I think, around $15,000 to update the house, put in a lease option tenant back when that was a very, very popular thing to do. Mm-hmm. And we cash flowed it for 3 years, getting a sizable payment every month on principal pay down. And then we sold it to the lease option tenant, at which point in time we then gave the $30,000. But what that did, that term, subject to, allowed me to just essentially create $40,000 out of thin air by cash flowing the house for 3 years, because the mortgage was in year 27 of a 30-year mortgage. And so we got her the 90 she wanted, but we only had to come out of pocket 20 at the front. And then we gave her the last 30 at the end. But there was all sorts of creative deals, and that was complicated, but you could function that thing a little differently, and say that, look, they wanted 90, and instead of giving them the other 30 at the closing 3 years later, we could have said, we'll give you, 50 today, and then we'll take over your payment, which would have been the 90, would have given them the full 90 because they owed about 40 on the house. Mm-hmm. So there was a couple extra wrinkles in there to make that complicated, but that's just an example of what's the number they want. give them that number, but back out the remaining mortgage owed and just say, can I take over your payment? And if it's in year 1 of year 30, that's helpful as far as leverage goes. There's nothing wrong with doing that. But if it's on the tail end of the mortgage cycle, then you're getting a ton of principal pay down. And so you're just basically warping Lightspeed forward 27 years into this mortgage and accelerating to the point that it's a really healthy principal pay down.
Yeah.
So that was a great one. That was mostly
on that one. You basically, your tenant buyer is the one that paid that down. So that's where you were creating the money there, because you didn't have to pay down 40,000. You're able to get a tenant in there. They paid down the 40,000, and that tenant buyer, when they bought it, they paid off the 30.
That's right.
Because they went and got their financing, which would have paid off a second mortgage.
That's
so there's a lot of gold in that, guys. I hope if y'all have a pen and paper, you should write down some of this stuff, because this is a great idea. One major takeaway from that I want to just throw out there and have everyone think in the back of your mind, if you can't get to a deal with someone, is that seller, can they carry back a second mortgage? Can they hold on and let you pay them over time, or at a balloon in 3, 4, 5 years? We've used that a few times where it's like, seller, we want to buy this, we want to help you, we want to get this done. We can only do this much today, but in a year we'll pay you this, or every month for the next 3 years we'll pay you $100 or whatever, whatever the number is.
Right.
So that gives you the option of using, if it's a rental, using your tenant's money, their payments, to pay back your purchase price, which is just a way of expanding your capabilities.
Right. And let me hit on a few other quick things, because I imagine some people are asking, how do you find somebody that wants to do that? Or how did you come to that conclusion? And the reality is, it was a distressed house. It needed $15,000, and this seller didn't have it. I could have easily went and gotten a hard money lender, or went and tied up and gotten, remember, 90 was the number she wanted. I could have easily went and got 90 grand and paid her the 90 she wanted. But I told her, I said, I'm going to have to come out of pocket 15 grand to fix this thing up. And so I just said, I can give you the 90 that you want, but you're going to have to help me. And so I think we started with the whole, can I take over your payment? And so we got there, and then I said, well, okay, we got another 30,000 to play with. Can I give you that in 3 years when it sells? Well, I don't know. I'll sign a mortgage. You'll be backed by the mortgage, which, by the way, is worth noting that when people get nervous about letting you take over the house, if any of those terms involve you making renovations or repairs, you got to say, look, we're getting in this deal together. I'm taking the risk that I'm going to be spending my hard-earned money fixing this house up. And if I don't do what I'm supposed to do, you're backed by a mortgage. You can kick me off. It takes a little while to do this, and you'll be foreclosed on me, but you don't make that point. But just say, look, you have your hooks sank into this house. I'm about to spend my money to fix it up. If I don't make the payment, guess what? And you take it back, you've got a lot nicer house. So we're getting this thing together as far as risk goes. So that's worth noting. How did that happen? You tell the lady, look, I can give you your money, but I can't give you all of it at once if you want that much.
Yep. It's great. That's great. And that goes for people, guys, if you, it might be a great deal, but you just don't have the capital. You just don't have the money because you're new at this, or you're tied up with 7 other projects, wherever you are in your business. This works even if you can afford it, right? I mean, you can still ask those questions. So Todd, what's one more good example that we can look at that will maybe something different that you've done?
All right, so I've got 2 more examples. The one I'll do next is somewhat complicated, so I'll try to go through it slowly. If you want me to stop and restart on parts, please let me know. But recently, I've had a few leads that I've converted that came to my attention because of a problem tenant, an out-of-town owner looking to evict the tenant. They take over the property. It's in disrepair. There's a lot of repairs needed, and they don't live anywhere close, and there's nothing they can do. So they think that they want a cash offer. They think like, hey, if you can just pay me this, which is pretty much what I owe on it, I'll be satisfied, or what I owe on it plus a little bit. I mean, I did a couple of this just in the last year, but I'll give you an example of one of them because it's the most recent, because the numbers are really, really good. So the house was in a bad state. Tenants had torn it up. Owner lived in another state. Tenants left, and the mortgage balance was about $97,000.
Okay.
I told the guy that I could probably not give him all that he owed on that, but I could try. But that I also had an idea where I could make him a little bit of money. And he said, well, that's interesting. Tell me what you want to do. And I ran the numbers. It was going to take about $35,000 to fix up this house. The back end value was about $180,000, and he owed about 97 on it. For easy math, let's say he owed 100 on it, just for easy math.
Yeah.
So he owes 100 on it. And it's going to take me about $35,000 to get there up to 180. And what I agreed to do was, instead of buying it from him, and I asked him, can I do this thing subject to? And he said, I don't know about that. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, let's do this. This, by the way, this is a little more complicated, but I did a title search on the property. I did a judgment check on the owner to make sure that he had no other debts or any other liens that might be attaching to the property. And because he was an out-of-state owner, it really, the way our judgment laws work, they're generally good only in the state in which they're filed. So I don't have to go look at all the states. I can just look in South Carolina. And so he came back clear, and I said, I'll tell you what, I'll make your mortgage payment if you'll sign this affidavit of interest. And I essentially became a second mortgage holder and spent the $35,000 on my own under the terms that I would pay him a couple $1,000 at closing, and I would take over his mortgage payment if he'd let me renovate the house. And he said, well, that sounds like a good deal because I still own the house. And if you don't come good on what you're trying to do, you just renovated my house for me. And so I said, that's exactly right. And I'm making your payment for you. So it's no skin off, you at all. And the numbers worked out really quick and easy, and we sold it. And essentially I came out of pocket about $37,000, around $35,000 for the repairs, a couple mortgage payments that I told him I'd make. And we closed at about 183. And so we came out of pocket about 37 and netted close to almost 50, 45-ish when it's all said and done.
Wow.
And never had to come out of pocket to actually buy the house. Never paid off his original mortgage. The new owner did, who bought it recently.
Yeah. So that's awesome. I mean, that's exactly what we're talking about here, is being creative. How can we buy properties? It's not really about ownership. It's about control. Mm-hmm. And controlling real estate so that the profits can come to you. That's kind of the basic principle. Is you're able.
The best part, Andrew, is somebody can do this deal who can get a hold of $37,000. That's all you needed.
That's all you would have needed.
$180 to buy the house. You didn't need to pay it off. All you needed was $37,000. If you could borrow $37,000 from someone, you could have done this deal and brought your 37 back home with another 45 tied to it. More than double your money in about a 2.5-month window of time.
Yeah. A deal like that, you could find a partner that would help with that. I know there's partners in our group. I mean, you come to me with that kind of deal, we'll talk about it. So that's an awesome and creative way. I love that you did that, Todd. And you did mention a few legal things that we always just tell people. Talk to a closing attorney. Whenever you're getting into a deal like that, you should still run it by into a closing attorney to let them check the title, make sure you register your interest with the counties so that you're protected. But that's a little bit high level. We don't need to get into that. So tell me that other real quick, because we're going to have to get off in just a minute.
Sure.
We're running longer, but just tell me that other example of another creative deal, because I like this one.
Yeah, and this one's not really that complicated. Bought a house right at the end of last year, and someone had a really short deadline. They had to sell by the end of the year. And so the last week of December, you have a very motivated seller, and they've got a number they want to get to. And in this particular case, I believe the number was 130. Mm-hmm. And this one I just recently bought. We're in the middle of construction. It'll be fun. I'll be happy to share all the after photographs when we go to market. And it's a pretty big renovation. But from a cash flow standpoint, we had a couple of deals tied up, and we were, a little bit leveraged at the time. And so we just needed some short-term help because we wanted to meet this guy's demand of a end of the year closing with only a week's notice. He's saying, I need to sell by the end of the year. Well, we said the only way we can do that is if we give you a little bit now. And then I know that I got a flip closing a couple weeks from now. So I'll give you another piece of the pie in another 30 days. And what even sweetened the pie more was the last third piece of the pie was just his mortgage balance. So this actual owner was getting all his equity up front. And so what we essentially agreed to was just terms where we'd give him $10,000 within a week's notice to get to the closing. He actually deeded it over. He took back a second mortgage. We paid him another $60,000 roughly about 30 days later, which was fine because we'd had a couple other flips closed and we were able to easily fund that without having to borrow the money from a bank. And then we had another 30 days to get the last portion paid off, to which again, we had another couple flips closed. So somebody might ask, why do you do all that? Well, because borrowing money can cost money. And if you don't need to borrow it, then you can add your savings. And so in this case, and actually, believe it or not, one of those flips is the one I just described with the clouding of the title. So I got that 37 grand back plus the 45. Guess what? I used all that to make that $60,000 second payment.
There you go.
And so that's kind of another example of where I didn't have to go talk to a commercial. Not that there's anything wrong with them, but lenders, it takes time and it takes money to get money from a commercial lender. And so that's not a real, again, haymaker. It's not going to be one that you take and run off with and make tons and tons and tons of money, but it is one that helps you to manage your cash flow and to save. Because anytime you have to get a commercial lender involved, I mean, that's $2,500 to $3,500 for commercial appraisal, title insurance, flood certifications, tax return.
All the things it takes, time and money, where, you really solved an issue for a seller that he would have most likely never been able to do. But because you're thinking outside the box, you're getting creative, and you've been doing this for so long, and you know that there's options. Like, that's the way I go into deals, is there's a problem here, and there's a solution to it. Let's think about outside the box. How can we get to that? So that's where new investors can really make their money. They can really do better and get ahead of the game by trying to solve those harder problems, because other investors will just look over them. But if you sit there and you actually try to work hard on a problem and solve it, you can make money doing it. So thank you for sharing those. Those are incredible examples. I know that people are going to try to wrap their head around it. Hopefully you guys will listen to this podcast a couple of times and take notes and really just think about, what can you do in your business? How can you grow your business or get your business started by using some of these creative strategies, buying on terms? Look it up, ask us questions, come to REI Live, and we will talk a lot more about this. Todd, I really, really appreciate you being here with us. I know that you're local here in Columbia, and people can find you with the Todd Realty Partners. What's the website for them to reach out?
ToddRealtyPartners.com.
Okay, so super easy. You can find him there. I don't think he's too active on social media. So
I need to do a better job of that.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm not too good at it either. So I appreciate it so much, Todd. Thank you so much for sharing. Is there anything else that you want to leave for a new investor? Actually, you know what? Let me I'm not going to give you free reign. I'm going to ask you, what do you wish you knew when you were a new investor that you know now? What's that one thing that you'd say, new investor, bam, you need to know this?
And get in the weeds of doing deals, or partner with people, or ask if you can follow them along and tag along and do it, because it sounds crazy, but I look up and almost 19 years later, I've done 350 plus, flips. And it's kind of like, holy cow, how do you do that? Well, you just get neck deep in it, and you rarely will see a problem you haven't seen before when you do it that many times. And so reach out to somebody and say, can I tag along? Because it's lonely in this world. It's fun to do it together with people. So I would definitely say reach out to somebody who's doing what you want to do, and go follow them along, tag along, and get submersed in it.
There you go. I appreciate that's awesome advice. It's exactly what I would have said. So, tag along, join REI Live, whatever group if you're not here in Columbia, whatever groups near you, get in with like-minded people. You'll find Todd. He hangs out with us at REI Live too. So thank you guys. Look forward to seeing you next time. This podcast, you catch us every Tuesday when we drop the latest one. So thank you so much, Todd, and we'll talk to y'all soon.
Thank you.
All right. I will stop recording.